My name's Josh Lubin-Levy. I'm a Joan Tisch Teaching Fellow at the Whitney Museum. And welcome to the second week of Inside the Whitney Biennial 2022. If you're joining us again, welcome back. And if not, the way this course runs is I have a slideshow with materials I'll go through for about 45 minutes. And at the end, I will reserve some time for question and answer. But you should feel free to ask questions at any time just using the Q&A button that's in the Zoom toolbar. For those of you who are looking for captioning, there is information about accessing the captioning in the chat. So I would go to the chat in the Zoom toolbar to find out information about that. So as I mentioned, there are many ways in which this year's biennial curators are drawing on the past to think about the present. And one of the ways that they've done that is to make some really explicit references to biennials of the past. One of those is the 1993 biennial, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it feels like a great way to think about today's theme, which is figuration. Figuration usually means figuring the body, the human body, but I'm thinking about figuration more expansively here. How are artists in this year's biennial thinking about the human form and the body, putting the body center stage, but also trying to think about questions of how we figure or give form to systems that are complex, often that capture or surround the body in different ways. So the way that today's structure will work out, we're going to look at some artists who are loosely associated with using the human body. Then we'll think about artists exploring minimalism and its relationship to the body, then ideas about systems, and then if we have time, some portraiture. But to talk for a minute about the 1993 biennial, which was hugely influential for Adrian Edwards and David Breslin, who are this year's curators. The 93 biennial is probably best known for being a biennial that caused great sensation when it premiered and became quickly known as the Identity Biennial. There were a number of artists who used forms of identity and identity positions to explore various topics in contemporary art. It was panned by critics, hated, and yet in hindsight, it's really a biennial that was a watershed moment in the way artists might deploy personal narratives and personal biography, as well as identity, as a way of thinking about broader systems and structures of both privilege and oppression. At the 93 biennial, there was no more famous work than this piece by Daniel Joseph Martinez, which is called Museum Tags, Second Movement Overture, or Overture con claque, Overture with hired audience members. And what Martinez did was supplement the museum tags that visitors used to get when they visited the Whitney Museum of American Art. And he allowed some of them to have the Whitney's logo, WMAA, on them. Others said, I can't imagine ever wanting to be white, or the full phrase, I can't imagine ever wanting to be white. And what's really interesting about this piece, of course, is that it brings the question of race directly into view right on that moment that you enter the precipice of the museum. Some read this as a kind of indictment, a kind of slander against the idea of being white, particularly in the 90s, in the era of identity politics. But I think the phrase itself actually is about the idea of imagining what it is to be white. And if we think about how little there was in terms of work that was imagining the condition of whiteness, when there's so much cultural production around ideas of imagining difference through the non-white body or the non-white subject position. So there's a way in which Daniel Joseph Martinez is turning the tide on viewers and getting them to become complicit in this idea about how whiteness often goes unmarked in cultural, institutional spaces, especially in the spaces of art. What I really love about this piece is that it's almost like Renee Green's space poems, which we saw at the beginning of last week's class. The artwork exists insofar as viewers are wearing these tags and walking in and among themselves. So it really is a social work of art where viewers become complicit in creating the work themselves. And the phrase comes together and falls apart as you pay attention to who you're sharing the gallery space with, rather than looking at the walls around you. That might be a great way to think about what Martinez's work has become in more recent years, where he's really centered himself, his body, this is Daniel Joseph Martinez here, but in these very violent and visceral ways where it's almost about dismantling his sort of heroic position as an artist. A lot of photographs that Martinez has staged, like the one here, show his body in states of death, decay, disrepair. Here you see the artist actually beheaded. And that's what led into the series of works that are on view in this year's biennial, with which the shortened title is really just 3 critiques, the Posthumanist Manifesto for the Future. And it has this very long title. But what the work is made up of is 5 singular photographs, none of which were made with post-production or edited after the fact. They're all done with prosthetic makeup and staging. So it's actually Daniel Joseph Martinez transforming himself into 5 different images, all of monsters drawn directly from Hollywood or TV production. So some of those monsters include figures like the engineer from Ridley Scott's Prometheus, who we see here. Then there's an image I actually don't have, which is the figure Nosferatu from the Dracula stories. Here you have the monster from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You have the bounty hunter from the X-Files, an alien race that's able to shapeshift and often takes the shape of different humans. So you see this kind of transformation, it's this really gruesome process of shapeshifting, if you know the X-Files. And then finally, an image that may be familiar to many of us is the drone hosts from Westworld. These are the substructures of the drones that end up getting painted, and they act like humans in the Westworld world. So what is this all about, right? You have these 5 different characters, none of which are technically human, but all of which are approximating human characteristics and human forms in certain ways, whether it's the aliens from X-Files or the drones from Westworld or the monster from Frankenstein, who's somehow an assemblage that tries to become human. And what Martinez has talked about is twofold with this. One, why is it that we have so many stories about monsters approaching the condition of humanity? And how might that be actually a critique of what we think of as what it means to be human, like the characteristics we prize in our human progressive values? But then on the other hand, insofar as humans are incredibly complicit in the ongoing destruction and climate decimation of the world, how is it that the monsters have now become our heroes? These figures who are post-human, exceed the human conditions, in some ways are now the kind of heroic figures that Martinez is turning to, rather than the human themselves. Martinez is one of the artists who was in the 93 biennial, as well as the 2022 biennial. Another artist who shares that split is Charles Ray. Charles Ray's sculptures occupy the 5th floor terrace of the Whitney Museum. And if you know Charles Ray's work, he really is someone who thinks sculpturally, working in scale and mass and form with very traditional types of sculpture, but very unusual subjects. In the case of the terrace, what he has are 3 sculptures, which are called Jeff, that's in the far background, Burger, and then 99 bottles of beer on the wall. Charles Ray's inclusion in the 93 biennial included this incredibly wonderful and incredibly creepy sculpture called Family Romance, where he has a nuclear family, father, mother, and 2 children, all of which are holding hands. They form this kind of family barricade. But what he's done is scaled their bodies so they're all equivalent scales. So the children aren't smaller than the parents, but they are exact scale. And it renders them very strange, kind of strangely erotic in a way, insofar as they're, of course, all nude. And the idea that Charles Ray is playing with the idea of the nuclear family, really attending to the kind of erotics, maybe the Freudian reading of the family in the era of the culture wars, in an era in which questions around family value were circulating in public discourse, is certainly part of what he's putting on display. The other thing is that just by playing with the scale of the sculptures, Charles Ray is also sort of indicting questions about the power dynamics of this family. We don't have a patriarchal figure who stands towering over his much smaller children. We have children that have grown to these gargantuan sizes and parental figures that have shrunk down in this sort of imbalance of a structure, or it's actually a balancing that makes it feel really creepy to see them all at the same scale. So again, this sort of dismantling of the heroic figure, much like with the Daniel Joseph Martinez. A similar sort of play with scale and figure is evident in the 3 sculptures that Charles Ray has included on the terrace. 99 bottles of beer on the wall is the most recent sculpture, and it's actually of a college student, very drunk, sitting on cases of Budweiser beer. And Ray cites this sculpture to seeing a drawing at the Getty Institute in Los Angeles of a drunk peasant, and saying that the peasants of today are really college students who are so deeply in debt that they'll never get out of. Then you have Burger, which comes from Charles Ray's obsession with Burger King. He walks a lot as an artist and talks about walking through Burger King every single day just to see what's going on there. And Burger is the figure of a UPS worker who at 8 in the morning was sort of staring longingly at this burger, perhaps out of hunger, but there's this sense that something about the burger, the kind of satiation of eating this burger, is this kind of kingly moment here. And then you have Jeff, which is probably the most complicated and also the most kind of enchanted sculpture insofar as it's in this very shiny steel. Jeff is a figure who is a drug addict, and you see him here zoning out and into space. Now, you'd only know that if you read about who Jeff is and where this model actually comes from. But what you actually see on the terrace is a figure that seems to be in this kind of moment of deep contemplation and deep suffering. So there's this way in which Charles Ray moves these figures out of their social context. We don't read the UPS uniform. We don't know about Burger King. We don't know about the drug use. We don't know that this is a college student who's drunk. We just see these 3 male figures all in sequence on the terrace. In some way, there's a progression from college age to the older figure of Jeff. But they're all figures who in different ways are staging scenes of intoxication with beer, with burgers, with the world around them. Charles Ray has talked about this as like Jeff being the kind of Christ-like figure, Burger being the Eucharist, the beer being like the blood and the wine, so it having this religious connotation. And certainly none of these are figures that we would think about as kind of monumental sculptural subjects. They're not the heroic figures that we often find depicted in larger than life sculptures in public parks and public areas. So there's this sense of elevating something that's prominent in the world, like college debt, and creating a monument out of it, and making it something that we have to confront in the physical space of our environment. Charles Ray has talked about not wanting to make sculpture that makes you think, how did this get here? But really is a sculpture that says, this has always been here. I'm just giving shape and giving form to it. Charles Ray's interest in kind of conjuring figures out of space and really attending to both like celebrated reverential moments, but also sort of abject scenes is something we might see as resonating with the work of Brynden Johnson, who has displayed here 4 objects that all look like paintings, but are actually made out of treated leather. So we're looking at skin. The signification of skin is a big element of Johnson's work. A Black artist who's thought a lot about how skin and skin color get kind of rendered or reproduced as a form of racialization, or we might call it epidermalization, the way the skin of something gets read back into and onto the content, the depth, the meaning of the works themselves. To make these pieces, the way that Brynden Johnson works is to take leather, treat it, and then leave it outside in Los Angeles so that it was subject to the elements for over 2 months. He then returned to the leather, stretched it over stretcher bars so it starts to look like a painting, and then dyed each one of these panels with different materials so that they take on a very different kind of pallor. They have different markings and tones, and it's a process of dyeing known as ebonizing. Again, bringing in this kind of this metaphorical reference to Blackness in the context of dyeing the skins themselves. In terms of using leather, what Brynden Johnson has said he's really interested in is that leather is a byproduct of the cattle industry. In the making of meat and milk, leather is often the thing that's the remainder. And though sometimes it's treated as a luxury product, often cattle ranchers will throw the leather out. Johnson has associated the byproduct of leather with the byproduct, as he says, of Blackness. The idea that the social construction of race, and particularly of Blackness, is a product of chattel slavery, and the ways in which the traffic in the body relates back to this deep kind of trauma and violence and exploitation around the actual physical body itself. So there's something about the play with skin, the markings of the skin, and when you have all of those associations, which are brought into it through the long titles that Johnson gives to his work, you have these moments where you look at the series of panels alongside one another, and you kind of start to wonder, do you want it to look more like leather? Do you want it to look more like a painting? Are these moments of the skins actually being liberated from their skinliness, their fleshy qualities? Is that an aberration in them? How are we supposed to read the kind of treatment, the markings that accumulate on these skins themselves? And it really is an open-ended reading for Johnson. Now, in terms of bringing us just around to the question of the body and to end with this section on the body and body art, Coco Fusco has done a beautiful work that's a video piece. It's really a kind of monument to mourning around COVID-19 and the unnamed victims of COVID. What Fusco has done is create this performance where she rows a boat around Hart Island, which is the largest mass grave in the United States. It's an island just off the coast of the Bronx. And for hundreds of years, unnamed, unclaimed dead have been buried at Hart Island, going back to tuberculosis outbreaks, the AIDS crisis, and now COVID-19. A lot of that was done, a lot of the burials were done by prison labor. So there's this really kind of dark history to what Hart Island is and what it stands for. And in a way, kind of mining the dark histories of dehumanization is at the heart of the way Fusco uses her body to bring those histories to light. In a more playful sense, a satirical form, The Couple in the Cage is a performance work that toured the United States and ended at the '93 biennial. And in it, Coco Fusco and Guillermo Gomez Peña pose as Amerindians from this imaginary tribe. They pose as these native subjects in a cage, referring back to the long history of the display of human bodies of non-white subjects in things called human zoos. And though this was a parody, and though it was very clear it was a parody, because in the Watanabe, that's the tribe they call themselves, the Watanabe cage, you see a TV, you see Coca-Cola, you see a Casio radio player, Gomez Peña is wearing a belt from WWF. Even though it's so clearly satirical, there is a number of viewers who take this as real. So there's this way in which the kind of performance of race gets repeated over and over throughout this work. With Hart Island, it's a much more somber performance. It's Fusco not performing a character, simply rowing this boat around and dropping flowers into the water. And she cites this dropping of flowers into the water to a kind of a memory from her own Cuban heritage of Cuban Americans throwing flowers into the ocean to kind of mourn the dead, the lost at sea, particularly in the Cuban refugee crisis. So there's this way of trying to enact this sequence of mourning, and what she ends up doing by rowing all around Hart Island is actually drawing a line, illustrating with her body a line around this space, this site that usually goes unmarked and remains invisible to many, especially many New Yorkers. The inclusion of the body as a central figure in the kind of raising up of history is something that brings me then to Rebecca Belmore's work. And though Belmore was not included in the '93 biennial, she's an artist who, like the '93 biennial, was really at the forefront of a kind of practice that is incredibly contemporary and really aligned with so many contemporary artists' works. Belmore's work in the biennial this year is called Ishkode Fire. And Ishkode is the Anishinaabe word for fire. As Belmore writes of it, the sculpture is symbolically about an absent figure speaking to the history of gun violence. And what she's done to create this work is actually drape this blanket over a mannequin and then cast it in clay. Now, before we get to that, I should say that Rebecca Belmore's work is really centered around performance practices in which she uses her body. Artifact number 671B from 1988 is the first durational performance that Belmore did. And it was her using her body as an Ojibwe artist to call attention to the violence against Native communities that she's very well known for and that's happening inside of Artifact, the performance here. What's happening in this moment is that Belmore, who's based in Canada, is performing in relationship to the fact that Calgary was hosting the Winter Olympics, and there were touring exhibitions of Native arts and culture sponsored by Shell Oil. These exhibitions were largely historical. So in a way, they erased contemporary Indigenous artists and Indigenous cultural producers. They weren't in solidarity with those producers, but they were trying to kind of pose this idea of indigeneity as a historical relic rather than a contemporary art. So that's the idea of the artifact on display. The other thing that Belmore is immediately drawing attention to is that Shell Oil sponsored these exhibitions, and it was a form of cultural diplomacy. But Shell Oil at the same time was fracking on indigenous land, which was literally toxifying the water in the communities. So there's this way in which Belmore is calling attention to the hypocrisy of Shell Oil and its attempt to both erase indigenous culture in the present and its ongoing violence of indigenous communities in this particular moment. For her work in the biennial, what Belmore has done is, as I said, create this cast sculpture of a figure surrounded by this blanket. And what's really striking about it is if you get close to this, you can see there's no body inside of it. It's an absent figure. This figure that Belmore has gendered as she is surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of bullet casings that have all been burnished by hand and woven together. So they have this skirt that almost becomes this protective barrier that really draws attention to that aspect of gun violence. Certainly the word fire relates to the idea of the gun, firing the gun as the kind of weaponization of things, the kind of assault of one body on another. But fire, as Ishkode in Anishinaabe, is also thought of as a generative force, fire as the center of the universe. Fire is something that holds things together. And simply by pairing even the Anishinaabe word and the English word, Belmore is drawing our attention to the way in which language itself is a sort of weapon of culture, insofar as one of the ways in which indigenous communities have been erased is through forced assimilation to American schools and to the speaking of English and the erasure of indigenous languages. Now, with Ishkode Fire, I love that you not only have these bullets that draw attention to gun violence, but that the bullets here become protective. And what you have is this kind of monument to the kind of wandering figure who needs protection in this space and could be filled with anyone. So there's this almost opening up of who needs to be seen as shrouded by this kind of very protective structure that Belmore has built inside of the space of the biennial itself. The last artist I'll talk about in terms of the body, and this is a really interesting, very COVID-esque, but also very 21st century moment, is Jackie Connolly's work. And Connolly made this video during the pandemic that's included in this year's biennial called Descent into Hell. Descent into Hell shows it has two forms of video mashed into one long story that's displayed on 4 different video channels. And the video comes on the one hand from motion capture, where Connolly has created her own 3D universe and actually created these figures that are often based on herself. And then the other is a character, an avatar that Connolly has created who wanders through the video game Grand Theft Auto. So it's a found universe from this video game Grand Theft Auto. And if you know the video game Grand Theft Auto, it's quite a sensational, even scandalous video game, both because it's a video game about stealing cars and robbing and going to strip clubs, but also for its deep misogyny. It's incredibly kind of misogynistic portrayal of women as sexual objects. So in Descent into Hell, what we see is this figure wandering through this deserted landscape. You see really ominous scenes, and there's this one really pronounced moment where this computer-generated image is inside of a mansion, wanders into this bathroom, and sees on the TV what appears to be actual footage of the actress Emma Watson in a porn film, until you realize that it's not actually Emma Watson. It's a form of deep fake media where Emma Watson's face has been mapped onto a porn actor. So that's the most fake moment, and yet it's compared to the kind of real emotional tenor of the CGI world. And really that kind of loss of the sense of reality between the supposedly real image that we see on the TV here and the computer-generated image or world that we're surrounded in is really at the heart of Connolly's work. It certainly speaks to kind of the COVID era when so much of our lives were lived on the screen. But I also think about this work as sort of a contemporary version of feminist body art, putting the female form, the female body in dialogue with the built environment. Only here it's not actual architecture and structures in the material world. It's the built environment of our 3D metaverse. Sometimes it's a world that Connolly has created, and in that sense, we might think of it as a liberatory world. Sometimes it's a world that's found, like Grand Theft Auto. And we see this world both being built and also burning. So there's this really powerful moment at the end of the film where you see this shadow figure that's kind of Connolly looking out at this sea of fire, these kind of wildfires. We might think about the wildfires over the past few years. But then superimposed on that is a shot of Connolly the avatar, one of Connolly's avatars inside of a domestic space. And that's where the scene ends. This figure lying on a couch, looking at a television, and between her and the television are all of the planets hanging on the ceiling. So this sense of kind of the inner and outer world merging into one. Now to move into the section on minimalism, just to quickly say, a lot of artists in the biennial are playing with kind of tropes of minimalism, which has long been thought about as a kind of sculptural practice that reduces the sculptural material to their very basic geometry. The other element of minimalist sculpture that has been written about and talked about, and certainly is evident in Robert Morris's work, is that these sculptures often have an uncanny presence because it's hard to tell exactly what they are or what they're referring to. They don't physically look like bodies, but they have the kind of phenomenological experience of being a body. And Robert Morris made this very pronounced in a photo he took inside of a sculpture called Box for Standing when he stood inside of his own box. And you really get the sense that this box wouldn't have only been simply an abstract sculptural form, but very much conjured the sense of something like a coffin. Morris repeats this in things like columns or two columns, which are these column structures that are roughly the height of a human. So they really do have the sense of a human standing and human lying. And he realizes this in a video piece, a performance piece that's recreated for video here, where he had this column actually stand on stage and then it falls. So this sense of the column actually having a kind of animate life to it. The column is taken up as a direct reference in the work of Aria Dean called Little Island Gut Punch, which is in this year's biennial. Gut Punch is a sculpture first made on 3D rendering software, so in a 3D modeling software. So it's a column-like structure that Dean creates, and then she uses a program to simulate punching that column in the gut. And what you have is this column that literally is kind of doubled over in the middle. It's kind of bent, it looks wounded. And it's not only a column that's been wounded, but it's a column that's sitting on a column. So it's a doubled up column, but it's also a column doubled over. Because you can see the base it's sitting on is a loose reference to ionic columns from Greek architecture and Greek sculpture. I'm going to skip this video actually just for the sake of time. And just to say that one of the things that's really great about what Aria Dean's doing with this work is doubling up sculpture in multiple ways. As I said, it's a sculpture that's doubling over on itself, but she's of course doubling back on the idea of Robert Morris's sculptures and the body. Only here the body, the idea of the sculpture having a phenomenological presence, is a body in pain. It's a body that feels really tactile, starts to feel almost skin-like in the way it's folding and creasing. And then she has the sculpture powder-coated and painted chroma key green, which means that it's the same color as a green screen, the kind of screen you would use in a photo or film studio in order to create a kind of a background that you can map computer imaging onto. So the sculpture itself is primed to become a digital image again, but to be a sculpture on which we project all sorts of digital fantasies and digital imaginings. And that might be one way you could think about the idea not only of the gut punch, but of the title Little Island. Because this work is positioned right near the Whitney's windows that look out on Little Island, which is a public park across the West Side Highway in Manhattan that has all these platforms and plateaus for looking at the city, looking at the water in different ways. But from the Whitney's windows, it's simply a kind of projection of nature, a fantasy of what the natural environment is, reproduced in a city that used to have natural environments here, but which were all destroyed through the processes of industrialization and the growth of the urban environment. So what we have now are parks that simulate nature. In some ways, that sense of simulation is carried through in this work. The idea of the column repeats across the floor, the fifth floor. Aria Dean's work is on one side. On the other end is Emily Barker's work, Death by 7,865 Paper Cuts. And what you have is this column-like structure made up of that number of pieces of paper, all of which are photocopies of medical bills and life care plans that come from a 3-year period in Emily Barker's life when she was deeply involved in the medical system, having suffered a spinal cord injury that left her using a wheelchair. So the column itself here is a really horrifying statement about the, as Barker says, the health, quote unquote, care system in the United States. The kind of burden of, at the time, a 19-year-old having to deal with all of this paperwork, all of these bills that come from suffering the iniquity of actually having to be part of the medical system in the United States, where it really is a massive industry and a massive business, but also the idea that there's something about these bills that's opaque, that we can't actually read them all, that they sit piled up, precariously balanced, almost like they're a spine stacked up in the gallery themselves. Barker has another piece right near the 7,000 and such paper cuts, which is called Kitchen, and it's a recreation of a kitchen space, all in this plastic, this translucent plastic, except here, all of the kitchen cabinets are reproduced at the height of 5 feet and 9 inches. So they're very tall. And in fact, they're done at the average height of the American male. And part of that is to recreate Barker's own experience of her kitchen. Kitchen cabinets are usually a standardized height, but of course that standardized height doesn't work if you are in a wheelchair. They're literally inaccessible spaces through the systems of standardization that have gone into production. And it's drawing attention to that Kitchen is trying to accomplish. But there's also this way in which Barker's work, insofar as it really is a phenomenological experience. You walk through it and you feel sort of dwarfed by these elements. You recognize that it's a kitchen, but it feels way too tall for you. That it really conjures the legacy of someone like Robert Morris again, where his sculptures were all about the phenomenological experience of being in the presence of these geometric forms that didn't tell you what their meaning was, but had this kind of vaguely animate quality to them. And in terms of the animate kind of, or the expectancy of an animate quality to our sculptures, we might then look at one of my favorite works in the biennial this year, which is by Eric Wesley, called North American Buff Tit. North American Buff Tit, as you can tell, is this sculpture here of this bird, and it's based on the kitschy dippy birds that you might find as a desktop toy. They're usually quite small, and the way they work is that as they heat up, the liquid in their base evaporates, pushing the liquid that's inside of it up a tube. The bird tips, it tips into a glass of water, which cools the head of the bird down. That causes the liquid to condense, and then it goes back and forth, dipping up and down. It's actually a pretty sophisticated heat engine. Albert Einstein was known to study the dippy bird for 3 months to try and figure out how it worked. And I love this idea that it's a bird that's mechanized or kind of rendered in motion by the kind of pressure that builds up inside of it. So insofar as Wesley has created a bird that's red, white, and blue, has this kind of Uncle Sam hat on, it really has this sense of a kind of bird that's waiting to explode, that's kind of filled with the tension of American politics bobbing up and down in some ways. Now, I'm going to skip through this, but to get to these works, you know, one of the things that's great about Eric Wesley's pieces is that they're both playful, they're comedic, but they also have a deep resonance with institutional critique. So one way we might think about his piece is both in relationship to this idea of a kinetic sculpture. And the playfulness of this could be thought back to things like the first automaton, which was a duck that was created in the 1800s that could chew pellets and then poop them out. And so it was thought of as this miraculous duck that actually mimics the biological functions of a body, but was all based on machines in some ways. And it's very playful, it's toy-like. The bird in Wesley's case is done at human scale. So it actually has this ominous quality. If this thing tips on you, it's kind of threatening. But insofar as it's a heat mechanism that's based all around the condensation and the evaporation of the liquid inside of it, we could think about it in relationship to one of the most iconic works of institutional critique, which is Hans Hakka's Condensation cube from 1963. Here, Hakka is taking that minimalist cube and he's making it translucent, and he puts liquid inside of it. And as the gallery heats up during the day, as more visitors attend the gallery space and the temperature goes up, the liquid inside evaporates, causing the cube to become this occluded object as liquid accumulates on its edges. And then as the gallery cools down, the liquid condenses and drips to the bottom. So if you actually see Hakka's condensation cube at the opening of a gallery, all the liquid is at the bottom and it changes throughout the day. So it adapts to the environment that it's in. Wesley's bird is absolutely a functioning tippy bird. It is similarly responding to its environment. That liquid is responding to the temperature. And if it got hot and humid in the gallery, the liquid would evaporate and that bird would tip. Only it's in an art gallery in a museum, and the galleries themselves are climate regulated, which means that this bird will never tip. We never let our galleries become hot and humid environments. So in some ways, the kineticism of the bird, its desire to move, is being obstructed by the Whitney itself. So there's something about the tension between how the museum maintains itself and what this sculpture actually wants to do. And in terms of that sense of the tension between the museum and its environment and the sculptures installed in it, another artist we might think about is the artist Michael E. Smith, whose sculptures here are very simple objects made of found materials. They almost look like trash, and that's very much part of Smith's aesthetic. They're not salvaged and reproduced in kind of some sort of beautiful form that would transmute the trash into treasure. These are old plastic bottles. They have motors on top of them, and inside of them are kneecaps. So they're like two rattling knees. They really have this eerie sense of two bodies. And rattling knees is often, meant to signal someone who is afraid, who's shaking, the knees shaking, right? And so you have these two knees shaking, and they draw attention to this hallway that one wouldn't often think about looking in when you're on the 6th floor gallery of the Whitney, because that hallway leads to a staircase that only staff can use, as well as a study room where works in the collection can be studied by visiting scholars as well as museum staff. And I love to think that maybe one of the things Smith is drawing attention to is the anxiety of putting work on display in the biennial, that one's work will be scrutinized and will be studied, or maybe even the idea that one's work becomes an object to be studied long after the artist has died. And certainly the idea that there are kneecaps inside of these bottles, there are pieces of a body, has this deathly or kind of morbid quality to it. And that is also figured in Smith's kind of brilliant inclusion in the Whitney's catalog for this show, where instead of including an artist bio or statement, what he's included is this work called 100 Fishes, which is 100 fishes by name. We might assume that these are the names of Michael E. Smith's pet fishes, but in a way, the life of a fish is very short. So here you're measuring the life of the artist in the terms of the life of the fish that have accumulated on this page. So there really is this kind of almost mournful quality, the deathly quality to Michael E. Smith's work as well. And that deathliness, the kind of horror that is elicited in a really uncanny way in Smith's works, is grounded in a very particular social and political critique in the work of Sable Elise Smith, whose projects throughout many years have drawn our attention to the carceral logics and the carceral system. Sable Elise Smith's work in the biennial is called A Clockwork. And it's this large moving sculpture, and it's made out of these modular units that Smith has been using for a long time. They're units that are based on the tables and stools you would find in prison waiting room or prison visiting rooms. And Smith is particularly interested in the visiting rooms, as she said, because visiting rooms are where a number of different constituents are kind of forced together. Prisoners, visitors, guards. There's something about the visiting room that's about the way we're all kind of captured or held captive to the logics of the carceral system. Not only that, but these tables, which have stools and table attached, are made by a particular manufacturing company that mass produces these tables for prison visiting rooms. And it's a billion-dollar industry that thrives on the carceral system. These tables, as Smith has said, need bodies to use them. So there's a way in which the tables themselves index the economy, the kind of value that's generated around mass incarceration. But it's also the idea that this is recreated as a large Ferris wheel. So Smith is talking about the circus of the carceral systems and the kind of spectacle and entertainment that surrounds this work, which is indexed in a video that accompanies A Clockwork that shows footage from police videos, the kinds of entertainment television that show people being arrested and actually thrown into jail. And you have this really dark and almost abject quality to thinking about how these shows perpetuate the idea of the carceral system as well. A Clockwork moves really, really slowly. So it has also this quality of like ticking down and ticking through time, serving time certainly, but also the time of these visiting rooms as this accumulated non-space where so much life is lived for so many who maintain relationships with those who are incarcerated. And Smith's work actually generates out of a very personal experience of her father being incarcerated. So there's a quality of these pieces having a sort of personal narrative to them as well. The use of spectacle and personal narrative come to fruition just across the gallery from Smith in the work of Alex de Corte, which includes a project called Roygbiv, based on the color spectrum, that has two elements to it. One is a video piece. We're seeing the screen on which that video is projected, but the other is the screen itself, which is actually a large box that over the duration of the exhibition will be painted in the color spectrum, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, ivory, and violet. And it's painted by Alex's brother, Americo de Corte, who's a professional house painter who comes into the gallery at various moments and essentially is attending to and taking care of his brother's work. The painting, the kind of evolution of the colors of this painting, Alex de Corte has cited to this work by John Baldessari, which is called 6 Colorful Inside Jobs. The work is a film in which you are looking from an aerial view into a room where one of Baldessari's students comes in every day and paints this room a different color in the color spectrum. And those days are condensed into 5 minutes. So it's this time-lapse video where you watch as this film shows you color evolve through this space. But because it's a film, even though it's a volumetric space, even though it has 3 dimensions, because it's a film, it's flat, and it's almost like a film that's become a kinetic painting. So film and painting are sort of merged here. That's one of the references for de Corte. The other, I would say, is, of course, his use of cinema and media and his merging of high art and popular culture. And Roygbiv, the color spectrum, is something that de Corte first used in this sculpture, recent sculpture from the American Speech series, which says Roygbiv, although you'll notice that Roygbiv are in the wrong colors. Like red is actually in blue light here. So there's this misappropriation of the color and the language here. But then also Red Hot and Very Blue, which is a title that comes directly from a photo of a film marquee showing a porn film in the 70s when porn films were called blue films, the Red Hot referring to the eroticism, and then in Technicolor, referring to Technicolor cinema or color cinema, which all has a bearing on what we see in the film Roygbiv. The film Roygbiv centers around the gallery at the Philadelphia Museum where Constantin Brancusi's sculptures are installed. And those sculptures were actually installed by Marcel Duchamp, who is a very close friend of Brancusi. What we see is Alex de Corte dressed up with prosthetic makeup to look like Marcel Duchamp, installing these sculptures, centrally installing the sculpture called the Kiss, which is almost like this minimal sculpture of 2 figures in an embrace. Marcel Duchamp evolves eventually into his alter ego, Rose C'est la Vie, who is also played by de Corte. And you can see Rose C'est la Vie in the image all the way to the right here. You have this rose-colored tint. Then there are these primary color spotlights that move around the room, actually indexing the color spectrum. Then the Joker from Batman appears with these neon light paintbrush and paint palette. And as he moves his paintbrush over these sculptures through movie magic, the sculptures actually become colors. And then we zoom in on the Kiss sculpture, which through a stop motion animation actually becomes this animated figure where it goes from being a figure that is actually 2 bodies held in an embrace to separating from one another. So what's really happening here is you see this evolution of a scene of kind of love and desire and longing in various ways. On one hand, you have Marcel Duchamp and his fidelity to Brancusi, these 2 paired, sort of matched by the Kiss as 2 figures holding one another. Then Rose C'est la Vie, who's the double of Marcel Duchamp, and whose name actually spells out Eros C'est la Vie when you speak it out loud, so E-R-O-S, even though it's spelled R-R-O-S-E. Then you have the Joker come in, and it's like this nightclub scene. There's all this kind of eroticism and tension in the space. And that ends with this film where you see the kiss actually kissing itself and then pulling apart and suddenly turning blue when one of the figures goes away. And it ends with this scene of Alex de Corte dressed up and through CGI as the kiss, actually singing an Etta James song, the song I'd Rather Go Flying. Sorry, this is Alex as the kiss sculpture. I hit a button and we went back to the beginning of the clip, but you can see the full film playing on loop on the 5th floor of the Biennial. And maybe just to end, I thought I would bring in one last work, which is the work of Jason Rhodes, who's one of the quote unquote ghosts in the show. We talked last week about how there are several ghosts, artists who've passed away, whose work is being revisited or rethought through this year's Biennial. This is not the work included in this year's Biennial, but it's the work that Jason Rhodes included in the 1995 Biennial. And it's a work called My Brother Brancusi. So we come back to this theme of Brancusi that's present in Alex de Corte's work. And so it's just one of the many kind of beautiful hidden connections that you can find when you look deeper in these projects. What Rhodes is doing here is he's made a sculptural installation that recreates elements of his brother's bedroom. His brother set up this sort of makeshift studio / bedroom in his parents' garage. And Jason Rhodes' brother had this idea that he was going to get rich by becoming a donut mogul. And so he bought a donut making machine. And that's what you see in the foreground here, this donut making machine, which all makes these perfectly round forms, almost like minimalist objects that have then been stacked into these column-like structures, which look a lot like these infinite sculptures that Brancusi did. And then what Rhodes has done is through photo series on the edges of the gallery, he's actually compared photos of his brother's bedroom with images of Brancusi's studio. Brancusi's studio in Paris was really well known for being a social hub, a space where a lot of artists came to kind of learn from Brancusi as this master sculptor, but also a sort of chaotic space where Brancusi is known for these very essentialized, kind of simplified, beautiful forms. There was all sorts of material and rock and clay and marble scattered around Brancusi's studio. And so this is my way of saying that we're back to the same theme that we saw at the beginning with Charles Ray and Joseph Martinez, that Brancusi is the modernist hero, the kind of masculine patriarch of sculpture in some way, who strips everything down. And here Rhodes is suggesting that his brother is sort of idolizing that vision of masculinity, going to become this mogul who makes all these donuts, but yet is living in his parents' garage. So there's something sort of sad and sort of kind of bankrupt about this fantasy of the modernist hero that Rhodes puts on display in the way he marries Brancusi and his brother, and also Jason Rhodes himself, because what you'll find in this installation are elements of works that Jason Rhodes made that his brother took and used as display in his bedroom. So there's also this sense of intimacy and fidelity among these different artists as they think about and through one another. So the work that's on view in the Whitney's Biennial this year of Jason Rhodes is a project called Sutter's Mill. And I think it kind of brilliantly brings up the sense of the kind of multiple layers of historical figures, but also their intimacy. Sutter's Mill is this sculpture here. It's made out of aluminum pipes that have all been cinched together with these bolts that hold it up. It's really glistening in person. It has its own light on it. It shines. And it's a reference to Sutter's Mill, which is a historical site out in California. I'm sure many of you know it. Sutter's Mill was owned by a Swedish immigrant, and it was famous because in the 1850s, it became the heart of the gold rush when Sutter discovered gold inside of the mill. Now, what's really interesting about Sutter's Mill is, of course, not only that it was the hub of the gold rush, but the story that Jason Rhodes draws our attention to. And it's hard to see this, I don't have a good image of it, but you can see there's a chalice or kind of break in the platform that Sutter's Mill is standing on top of. And in that space are all of these clothes. What that's a reference to is the woman Nancy Gooch, a freed slave who actually came to Sutter's Mill and set up a business washing clothes and cooking for all of the gold miners. She ended up setting up this business and earned a lot of money, earned enough money to buy almost 400 acres of land around Sutter's Mill, including the property that Sutter's Mill was built on. And Nancy Gooch was able to free her entire family, and her family inherited this huge piece of land. So it's interesting to compare the idea of these gold miners looking for their speculative kind of striking it rich, and Nancy Gooch, who through this kind of physical manual labor is actually amassing and building up her own family's fortune. The story of Sutter's Mill is that in 1865, California seized a piece of Nancy Gooch's family's land under eminent domain so they could build a historical monument to Sutter's Mill and to the gold rush. And so though Nancy Gooch and the Gooch family didn't lose all of their land by any means, there is this sense of the way in which we value speculation and the get rich quick scheme versus the kind of labor and practices that are endemic to someone like Nancy Gooch. And that is figured in Sutter's Mill because it's a sculpture that, as part of the contract of having it on display, has to be dismantled and reconstructed every week. Sutter's Mill is taken apart and reassembled by the Whitney's art handlers all day, every Friday. And what they do is they take the whole thing apart and they put it on the scaffolding that you can see just behind it, this kind of wooden structure, and then they reassemble the piece. So there's this way in which the manual labor of constructing the work of art is literally brought into our attention. And as they're dismantling the sculpture, it's really hard not to think about, how it's so often that we look at a work of art and we speculate on its value in its kind of material presence, but we don't think about the labor that goes into maintaining the work, whether it's physical or maybe I could say even the intellectual labor that goes into supporting and sustaining the kind of field of art in which we practice. So with that, I'll take a moment now to turn to the Q&A and see if there are any questions I can answer before we have to end for today. I may have to there we go. Victoria Hibbs asks, are they actual human kneecaps in the Michael E. Jones? And yes, they are actual, Michael E. Smith, excuse me. They are actual human kneecaps. I'm not exactly sure where Smith got them. Smith is known for using found and often kind of abject materials, whether it's things that call attention to detritus and waste, like the plastic bottle or the kneecaps themselves. But certainly the use of human bones is something that we can find in a lot of works of art. So I don't believe that there's any more kind of deep story to it. Someone asked me, where he got them. I actually think kind of sourcing those sorts of materials is maybe easier than we think. I know that, for instance, one of the artists in the biennial, Cy Gavin, has a painting in which he includes actually human teeth that he was able to purchase from a dental museum. Sally Kuhn asks, isn't it Rose c'est la vie? Yes and no. I mean, Rose c'est la vie, as you spelled it out in the chat, it says in French, Rose, that's life, or c'est la vie, si c'est la vie. I can't really say it in clear, I guess. But Marcel Duchamp spelled it Rose with two R's. Rose, R-R-O-S-E. But it sounds like Eros, E-R-O-S, c'est la vie. Eros is life. And that's something that is Duchamp's sort of playful relationship between how a word is spelled and how it sounds, and the kind of found language and the way it lives both in the eye and the ear as different references. Can I talk more about the ghosts in the exhibition? Why are they ghosts now? Why does Rhodes' work, for instance, resonate now rather than when they were first made? That's a great question that Sarah's asking about the ghosts in the show. I think certainly, as we can imagine, a lot of the works in the show are thinking about mourning, as we're all going through an ongoing and perpetual kind of question about mourning in the wake of COVID-19 and the ongoingness of COVID. And so certainly that's one way we might think about these ghosts. The ghosts are also very personal to the curators themselves. Some of the ghosts are artists who've been really influential on the way that David Breslin or Adrian Edwards have thought. And so they wanted to bring their work into the exhibition. An artist I talked about last week was Denise Tommasos, and Adrian wrote a beautiful tribute to Denise Tommasos called, I believe it's called like My Ghosts, or In Tribute to My Ghosts, and it's in the New York Times that you can read about. And in terms of why these works resonate now, I certainly think that one of the things to say about Jason Rhodes' work is that talking about the Nancy Gooch element of this piece and the idea that one of the things that this work speaks to is the perpetual and ongoing dispossession of Black homeowners and Black landowners is something that we find much more prominent in contemporary artist work. I think of the previous biennial and Tomashi Jackson's paintings, which speak directly to the ongoing dispossession and the historical dispossession of Black landowners and Black homeowners. But in the time that Rhodes made this sculpture and these sculptures, his work was really primarily talked about in terms of markets and speculation and accumulation. Jason Rhodes is known for making these huge installation projects that have a massive materials. You can see it in my Brother Brancusi, but even bigger works that draw attention to the kind of abject nature of excess and late capitalism and consumption. He had a show, for instance, in London, where at the center of this massive installation, he had a soft serve machine that you could serve yourself soft serve, but nothing to serve it in. And people were serving soft serve to themselves in their hands and in their shoes. And it really had this grotesque quality of wanting to consume. So, when Rhodes made Sutter's Mill, it was a piece that was talked about in relationship to the gold rush. And maybe one of the ideas about the ghost or the resurfacing of this ghost is to ask us to think more deeply about the reference to Nancy Gooch and the idea of the kind of historical dispossession of her family from some of their land in 1965 here. That would just be one guess, but I think there are probably many more. Are there any art and activism works in the biennial? Sylvia asks, and that's a great question. Yes, there are certainly artists who are more kind of politically active. Rebecca Belmore is a great example of an artist who is very much involved in kind of political activism, if I can get back to her work, where Belmore is quite clear that in her project statement for Ishkode Fire, that this is a work protesting gun violence and the long legacy of gun violence, but also because Belmore's works have often been forms of durational performance art where she's using her body to draw attention to historical injustice. So that would be one. An artist I talked about last week who's very involved in art and activism is Rick Lowe, whose work is paintings in the show called Project Row House, but it's a reference to his project, Project Row House, where starting in '93, Rick Lowe and a number of other artists bought these row houses in the 3rd Ward in Houston and turned them into community centers that are ongoing. It's an ongoing project. It's still active today. So there are artists who are more politically active in the biennial, and it really kind of depends. We'll hear next week about artists who are actually thinking about the legacy of activism when I talk about the work of Julie Tolentino, who in addition to being performer, a former dancer, and a contemporary artist, also has a long legacy of being involved in ACT UP and AIDS activism. And her work is really thinking about the long legacy of care and collaboration and how we take care of one another through the legacies of activism. In terms of power structures, it seems to this viewer that many of the artists are doing riffs on corporate products, gaming and streaming products. And yet an assumption inherent in so much of these works is that corporations are evil, or at least reaping the rewards of nature and human resources. Thoughts? That's a great question. I do think there is certainly an indictment of corporations here. There's certainly a questioning of what it means to live so much of our lives under the structures of such mega online corporations like Amazon and Netflix. But there's also a certain way in which, if you look at some of these works, and I don't have a good image in front of me, but something like Andrew Roberts' sculptures and pieces that have these like zombie-like figures all dressed in like Amazon t-shirts. There's something about like the other life or the afterlife that we can live on the internet space. And this is different maybe than the way in which the internet, especially in like early 90s internet art was often thought of as the space that we could create our own universe. And now we really get the sense that the internet is also a space of surveillance. And how do we make art under the conditions of surveillance is one thing that we might think about, not simply to kind of indict these corporations, but to think that like there's a way in which the media that we're so kind of involved in and that have become so essential to our lives, it's not even optional to be on email anymore, is one way in which they're thinking about that kind of material as part of the medium in which they practice. I have time for, let's see, one more question. What is the significance of Brynden Johnson's supports for his leather paintings? Daniel asks. And Brynden Johnson is an artist who, as you can see in the title of the works, really deflects the idea of giving them a singular meaning. The title is like an accumulation of references. So I wouldn't dare to speak for the singular significance of the supports, but I will say that it's really interesting to look at the larger trajectory of Brynden's practice, who is trained as a photographer, and think that at a time, Brynden was using leather and installing it very sculpturally. And here it's really installed like paintings. So there's a way in which as a painting, it becomes really flat. It doesn't have the quality of a body anymore. It's almost like a surface to be looked at. And there's two ways that Brynden has talked about this that I've heard. One is to really treat the skin as like a photographic surface that reproduces all of the markings and evidence of history in it. Literally, our skin has all of our wrinkles and scars, and you could think about a photographer looking through their camera at a body and really seeing all those elements. But the other is that even though these are paintings and seem to be like fixed images, literally stretched on their frame, in the way that Brynden treats the dyes on these leathers, they're not fixed dyes. So if you install these works in the sun, in the shade, under certain lightings, they'll age in different ways. And that sense that they have an aliveness to them, that the color of these literal leather skins are changing and evolving and adapting and are non-static, further contributes to this idea that there's no singular reading of them. And I think that idea of getting beyond the singular reading or reference to the skin is another way in which Brynden Johnson's work activates something about a critique around the idea of skin as color or what might be called epidermalization, the reduction of the idea of race or embodiment or personhood to skin and to surface. So with that, I should end today's Inside the Whitney Biennial. Next week, we'll conclude by looking at the idea of retrospection, and we'll look at a number of artists who are really engaged in the big practice that this year's curators are, which is looking back at history and as a way to find a move forward. Thanks for joining, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your night, evening, day, depending on where you are in the world.